It was supposed to be a dream trip, a well-deserved moment of peace for Elena Carter. For years, she had worked tirelessly, dedicating her days and nights to the pursuit of justice as one of the most sought-after attorneys in the country. Known for her calm demeanor and sharp intellect, Elena carried herself with a quiet elegance that turned heads without effort. She wasn't flashy or ostentatious, she let her accomplishments speak for her. This trip wasn't about proving anything to anyone. For once, it was about her, about stepping away from the endless courtrooms, the stacks of legal documents, and the constant demands of clients. It was about indulgence and relaxation, a rare opportunity to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Elena had booked a first-class ticket on a long-haul flight, envisioning hours of uninterrupted luxury and tranquility. As she approached the first-class cabin, the soft hum of conversation quieted. Heads turned subtly, and whispers followed her. She could feel the weight of the stairs, but she had long grown accustomed to such reactions. Elena's poised walk and the understated power of her presence often left people curious, even intimidated. When she reached her seat, she placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled in, smoothing the fabric of her tailored blazer. The leather seat was plush and inviting, and the spacious cabin was a world away from the crowded economy section. Elena allowed herself a small smile, feeling the tension from her busy life begin to melt away. The flight attendant approached with a polite but perfunctory smile, her uniform crisp and her demeanor polished. Elena didn't think much of it, she had no reason to suspect anything unusual. "Good afternoon," the attendant said. "Can I offer you something to drink before we take off?" Elena glanced at the menu provided at her seat. She decided on champagne after all, it was a celebration of sorts. "Yes, I'll have a glass of champagne, please." There was a pause, a hesitation so brief it might have gone unnoticed by most. But Elena caught it, the faintest flicker of discomfort that passed across the flight attendant's face. "I'm sorry," the attendant began, her tone overly measured, "but this might not be available for you. Would you like something else?" The words landed softly, cushioned by professional courtesy, but their meaning was sharp and unmistakable. It wasn't what the attendant said, it was how she said it. The suggestion that champagne might not be available for Elena felt loaded, heavy with an unspoken implication. For a moment, Elena considered the situation. Her gaze met the attendant's, calm and unwavering. Years of legal training had taught her the power of silence and observation. She could see the subtle tension in the woman's posture, the nervous shift of her weight. Elena smiled, a small, composed smile that betrayed none of the irritation she felt. "That's fine," she said, her voice smooth and unbothered. "Water will do for now." The attendant nodded quickly, almost relieved, and hurried off to fulfill the request. As Elena leaned back in her seat, she couldn't help but notice the shift in atmosphere. Other passengers had seen the interaction, and she caught glimpses of their reactions. Some looked away quickly, feigning disinterest, while others exchanged quiet glances. A couple seated across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward Elena before turning back to their conversation. She was no stranger to this kind of treatment. It was subtle, often unspoken, but always present, a quiet reminder of the biases and assumptions that still lingered, even in places where success and wealth were supposed to level the playing field. Elena had dealt with it all her life, from doubting colleagues to dismissive opponents in the courtroom. She had learned to navigate such moments with grace, never letting them see her falter. But this was different. This wasn't a courtroom battle or a professional slight. This was supposed to be her moment of escape, her time to enjoy a well-earned break. And yet, even here, prejudice had managed to creep in. Elena let out a soft breath and glanced out the window. The plane hadn't even left the ground, and already the trip had taken an unexpected turn. She reminded herself to stay calm. There was no point in reacting prematurely. As the cabin prepared for takeoff, the whispers subsided, and the flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, securing trays and ensuring seat belts were fastened. Elena closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She had learned long ago that patience was her greatest ally. But there was a flicker in her eyes, a quiet intensity that hinted at something more. She wouldn't let this pass unnoticed. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what she was dealing with. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Elena leaned back into the plush seat. Her calm exterior remained unshaken, but inside, her mind was already at work, analyzing every detail of the encounter. What had prompted the attendant's hesitation? Was it an assumption about who she was or who she wasn't? And why had her champagne request been so quickly dismissed? The questions swirled in Elena's mind as the plane lifted into the air. She had spent her career uncovering hidden truths and exposing injustices, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this situation, however small it seemed, warranted her attention. For now, though, she would wait. She would observe. And when the time was right, she would act. Elena gazed out of the airplane window, watching the ground fall away beneath her as the plane climbed into the sky. The sprawling city below shrank into a mosaic of lights and shadows, a view she had always found breathtaking. But today, it failed to distract her. Her mind kept circling back to the interaction she'd just had, a moment so seemingly small yet brimming with meaning. The flight attendant's hesitation, her words, and the faint but unmistakable air of dismissal were like pieces of a puzzle Elena couldn't ignore. She had always been good at reading between the lines, an essential skill in the courtroom. But here, thousands of feet above the ground, she wasn't trying to win a case. This was personal. As the plane leveled out, another flight attendant passed by, offering warm towels to the passengers. Elena accepted one with a polite nod, catching a glimpse of the staff's body language as they moved through the cabin. It was subtle, but there was a distinct difference in how they interacted with the other passengers compared to her. The smiles were brighter, the tones more enthusiastic. Elena wasn't surprised. She had faced this kind of treatment before in restaurants, hotels, even exclusive events. There was always a moment when someone questioned her place in spaces she had every right to occupy. It wasn't always overt, often, it was hidden behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. But Elena had honed her ability to spot these microaggressions, each one a quiet reminder of the prejudice she still faced despite her success. She thought back to the champagne request. It wasn't about the drink itself, Elena could take or leave it. It was about the principle. About being made to feel that she didn't belong, that her presence was somehow out of place in a cabin full of luxury and privilege. Elena glanced around the cabin. The passengers seated nearby were immersed in their own worlds, reading, watching movies, or chatting softly. A few of them had noticed the earlier interaction, she was sure of it. She caught the eye of a man seated across the aisle, who quickly looked away. She couldn't help but wonder what they thought. Did they see what she saw? Or had they dismissed it as a minor misunderstanding, too inconsequential to warrant their attention? The first-class cabin was a study in quiet opulence. Plush leather seats reclined at the touch of a button, and the soft hum of the plane's engines provided a soothing backdrop. The menu on her tray table boasted gourmet meals and premium beverages, and the attendants moved with practiced efficiency. It was a space designed for comfort and exclusivity, a stark contrast to the chaos of everyday life. And yet, even here, the specter of bias lingered, unspoken but undeniable. The attendant returned with Elena's water, setting it down on the tray table with a practiced smile. "If there's anything else you need, let me know," she said, her tone neutral but lacking the warmth she had shown to other passengers. Elena thanked her, her voice steady. She took a sip of the water, feeling the coolness spread through her, and decided to let the moment pass for now. She wasn't one to react impulsively, especially when she knew that patience and strategy could yield better results. As the hours passed, Elena observed quietly. She noticed how the attendants interacted with the other passengers, their body language and tones shifting depending on whom they were speaking to. She caught snippets of conversations, the laughter and camaraderie that seemed to flow more freely when she wasn't involved. It was subtle, but it was there, a pattern of behavior that suggested something deeper than a simple oversight. At one point, the lead flight attendant came by to check on the passengers. She stopped to chat with a couple seated near the front of the cabin, her tone warm and engaging. When she reached Elena's row, the smile faltered, replaced by a professional politeness that felt distant. "Is everything all right, Ms. Carter?" she asked, her voice smooth but devoid of genuine interest. Elena met her gaze, her expression calm but unreadable. "Everything's fine," she replied, her tone measured. The attendant nodded quickly and moved on, eager to escape the conversation. Elena leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed, to choose her battles wisely. But this was starting to feel like a battle worth fighting. She thought about the years she had spent building her career, overcoming obstacles that others couldn't imagine. She thought about the countless hours of hard work, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt and frustration. All of it had brought her here, to this moment, on this plane. And yet, despite everything she had achieved, there were still people who looked at her and saw only their own assumptions. Elena glanced at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had connections, powerful ones, and she knew that a single call could set things in motion. But she wasn't ready to act just yet. She needed more information, more clarity. For now, she would wait and watch, letting the pieces fall into place. She had learned long ago that the best strategies were born from patience and observation. As the flight continued, Elena's thoughts drifted to her past. She remembered the moments that had shaped her, the challenges that had tested her resolve. She thought about the mentors who had guided her, the friends who had supported her, and the moments of triumph that had reminded her why she had chosen this path. And she thought about the injustices she had witnessed, the stories she had heard from clients who had faced discrimination and prejudice in all its forms. Each story had left its mark on her, fueling her determination to fight for a better world. Elena looked around the cabin again, her gaze sharp and discerning. She wasn't just a passenger on this plane. She was a witness, a participant in a moment that spoke to something larger than herself. The faint flicker of a smile returned to her lips. She didn't know what the rest of the flight would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't done yet. Elena reached for her notebook, the one she always carried with her, and began to jot down her thoughts. It was a habit she had developed over the years, a way to process her experiences and make sense of the world around her. As she wrote, the words flowed easily, capturing the essence of what she had seen and felt. Each word was a step closer to understanding, a step closer to deciding her next move. The flight attendant passed by again, her gaze briefly meeting Elena's. There was a flicker of something: uncertainty, perhaps, or even unease. Elena held her gaze for a moment, her expression calm but unyielding. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence, her quiet confidence, was enough. And as the plane soared through the sky, Elena felt a sense of clarity settle over her. She didn't know exactly how this would end, but she knew one thing for certain: she was ready. As the plane climbed steadily into the clouds, Elena began to notice patterns in the behavior around her, subtle but unmistakable. While she tried to focus on relaxing, enjoying the rare luxury of a first-class seat, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the small slights building up like layers of dust. The first clue had been her champagne request. She had brushed it off, deciding it wasn't worth reading too much into at the time. But as the minutes ticked by, the pattern became harder to dismiss. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, attending to the passengers with smiles and cheerful tones. Drinks were poured, meals were served, and questions were answered with warmth. Yet, when it came to her, the service felt different, slower, colder, and decidedly less enthusiastic. Elena asked for a menu, and the attendant hesitated before handing it over, as if it were a special favor. She watched as other passengers received prompt attention, their drinks arriving with a flourish, their requests met with eager smiles. Meanwhile, her requests, simple ones at that, seemed to take longer, delivered with an air of indifference that was impossible to ignore. She noticed the glances, too. Other passengers would steal looks in her direction, then quickly turn away, sometimes whispering to their seatmates. Their expressions weren't openly hostile, but there was a knowing quality to their looks, a quiet agreement that she didn't quite belong. Across the aisle, a man in his late 50s leaned toward his companion, whispering something that made them both chuckle. Elena caught snippets of their conversation, just enough to understand that she was the topic. It wasn't the first time she had encountered this kind of behavior, and she doubted it would be the last. But what made it sting wasn't the novelty, it was the familiarity. Elena had spent years proving herself in spaces where people like her were often underestimated or outright dismissed. She had earned her place in first-class cabins, exclusive boardrooms, and luxury events. And yet, despite all her accomplishments, there were still people who saw her as an anomaly, a puzzle piece that didn't fit their narrow vision of success and privilege. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs and folding her hands neatly in her lap. If there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was how to maintain her composure. She wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her react. Instead, she observed. The flight attendant returned to her row, carrying drinks for the passengers seated nearby. She handed a glass of wine to the man across the aisle, who accepted it with a grin and a casual, "Thanks, sweetheart." When the attendant turned to Elena, her tone shifted. "I'll be with you shortly," she said curtly, before walking away without waiting for a response. Elena's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. She could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, a quiet storm building within her. But she wasn't one to act impulsively. She preferred strategy over spectacle, observation over confrontation. The moments continued to pile up. A family seated a few rows ahead received a second round of drinks before Elena was even offered her first. The man across the aisle leaned back in his seat, sipping his wine and glancing at her with thinly veiled amusement. "You okay over there?" he asked, his tone casual but edged with mockery. Elena met his gaze, her expression calm and unreadable. "Perfectly fine," she replied, her voice steady. He chuckled, as if her composure were a joke he didn't understand. Elena turned her attention back to the window, willing herself to focus on the view outside. But the atmosphere in the cabin was impossible to ignore. The murmurs grew louder, the glances more frequent. It was as though the passengers around her had reached a silent consensus. Elena Carter, poised and dignified as she was, didn't belong in their carefully curated world of luxury. The tipping point came when a younger flight attendant approached her row, holding a tray with a bottle of sparkling water and a glass. The attendant placed the glass on Elena's tray table without making eye contact, then quickly turned to leave. Before Elena could say anything, a voice cut through the hum of the cabin. "Excuse me," the voice said, firm and clear. Elena turned her head to see the woman seated in the row behind her, a striking figure in her mid-30s, dressed in a sleek business suit. Her expression was sharp, her eyes narrowed in a mix of disbelief and indignation. "Why hasn't this lady been served her drink?" the woman asked, her tone calm but pointed. "Is there an issue here?" The flight attendant froze mid-step, the color draining from her face. She turned slowly, her professional demeanor cracking under the weight of the question. "Oh, the attendant stammered, clearly caught off guard. "I was just about to." "Were you?" the woman interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Because it doesn't look that way to me. Everyone else here has been served, and she's been waiting for over an hour." The cabin fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers turned in their seats, their curiosity piqued by the sudden confrontation. Elena sat quietly, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt, didn't interject. She wanted to see how the scene would play out. The flight attendant glanced at Elena, then back at the woman. I'll get her drink right away," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do that," the woman said, her tone icy. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms and shaking her head in disbelief. As the attendant scurried off, Elena turned to the woman behind her. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. The woman waved a hand dismissively. "It's nothing," she said. "I can't stand watching this kind of thing happen. People need to be called out for it." Elena nodded, her respect for the woman growing. It wasn't often that someone else stepped in to address the microaggressions she had grown so accustomed to navigating on her own. When the flight attendant returned with a fresh glass of champagne, she set it down in front of Elena with trembling hands. "I apologize for the delay," she said, her voice barely steady. Elena's gaze didn't waver. She didn't need to say anything, her silence was its own form of power. The attendant quickly retreated, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. She took a sip of the champagne, savoring the crisp, effervescent taste. It wasn't about the drink, it never had been. It was about the principle, the quiet resistance against a system that had tried, time and time again, to diminish her worth. And as the cabin settled back into an uneasy quiet, Elena knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The cabin settled into an uneasy stillness after the confrontation. Conversations that had briefly hushed resumed in muted tones, but Elena could still feel the tension in the air. She sipped her champagne slowly, her composure unwavering, yet her mind was far from at rest. The incident had shifted something not just in the atmosphere of the plane, but within herself. She glanced at the woman behind her, who had gone back to typing on her laptop as if nothing had happened. It was clear the woman had no patience for injustice, but what struck Elena was the ease with which she had stepped in. It was a reminder that even the strongest among us could use an ally in moments of adversity. But Elena wasn't used to relying on others to fight her battles. Her entire career had been a testament to her ability to rise above, to solve problems on her own terms. That independence had been hard-earned, forged in moments like this one, where she was forced to navigate the fine line between maintaining her dignity and asserting her rights. Across the aisle, the man who had mocked her earlier was now quiet, avoiding her gaze entirely. She allowed herself the faintest hint of satisfaction at that. It wasn't about making him feel uncomfortable, it was about the unspoken message that she wasn't someone to be trifled with. The flight attendant who had initially dismissed her returned once more, this time with a nervous energy. She bent slightly at the waist, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miss Carter," she began, her voice low and tentative, "I want to apologize again for earlier. It was an oversight, and it won't happen again." Elena looked up, her gaze steady. "I appreciate the apology," she said, her tone measured. "But an oversight suggests a lack of intent. Let's not pretend that's what this was." The attendant blinked, caught off guard by the directness of Elena's response. She opened her mouth to say something but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she nodded and stepped back, disappearing into the galley. Elena sighed, leaning back in her seat. It wasn't in her nature to humiliate anyone, but neither was it in her nature to accept half-hearted apologies that skirted the truth. The flight attendant's discomfort wasn't Elena's responsibility, and she refused to let it become her burden. As she returned to her thoughts, Elena replayed the events of the last hour in her mind. She was someone who valued fairness, someone who believed in addressing problems head-on. But what troubled her wasn't just the treatment she had received, it was the systemic nature of it. This wasn't about one rude flight attendant or a few judgmental passengers. It was about a culture that allowed such biases to persist unchecked. She thought of the countless other people who had likely endured similar treatment, people without the confidence or resources to push back. It was a sobering thought, and it only strengthened her resolve. Just as she was beginning to relax, a commotion from the galley caught her attention. Raised voices, though still muffled, drifted toward her. She couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the tone was unmistakable. Several passengers glanced toward the front of the cabin, their curiosity piqued. A moment later, the lead flight attendant emerged, her expression tight and her movements brisk. She made her way directly to Elena's row, stopping just short of her seat. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice controlled but lacking its earlier warmth, "I've been informed that there's been some dissatisfaction with the service. I'd like to personally ensure that the rest of your flight is comfortable." Elena tilted her head slightly, studying the woman. The lead attendant's words were polite, but her tone carried a subtle edge, a hint of frustration that betrayed her true feelings. It was clear this wasn't an olive branch, it was damage control. "Comfortable would be nice," Elena replied evenly. "But what I'd really like is consistency." "That's not too much to ask, is it?" The attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course not," she said. "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to let me know." Elena nodded, and the attendant walked away, her back stiff with tension. The interaction, while brief, left a sour taste in Elena's mouth. It was a reminder that even when people apologized, it wasn't always out of genuine remorse. Sometimes, it was simply a way to cover their tracks. The rest of the flight unfolded in a strained silence. The staff, clearly rattled by the earlier events, seemed to walk on eggshells around Elena. While the other passengers were still attended to with enthusiasm, the interactions with Elena were now marked by a cautious formality. It was an improvement, but it felt hollow, like a performance rather than a genuine effort to make things right. As the plane began its descent, Elena's thoughts turned to what would come next. She had a choice to make: let this incident go and move on with her life, or take action to ensure it didn't happen again to her or anyone else. By the time the plane touched down, her decision was made. Underscore 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 on. The passengers disembarked one by one, the hustle and bustle of the terminal a sharp contrast to the quiet tension of the flight. Elena waited until the majority of the cabin had cleared before gathering her belongings. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt the eyes of the flight attendants on her, their expressions a mix of wariness and relief. She paused at the entrance to the galley, turning to face the lead flight attendant. "I trust you'll take this experience as an opportunity to reflect," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Because next time, I won't be this quiet." Without waiting for a response, she exited the plane, her heels clicking against the jet bridge floor. Each step felt like a reclaiming of her power, a reminder that she was in control of her own narrative. As she walked through the terminal, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen, a text from one of her colleagues, asking if she had arrived safely. She typed a quick reply before pausing, her fingers hovering over the screen. Elena scrolled through her contacts, her thumb landing on a familiar name. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing call. The line rang twice before a voice answered, warm and professional. "Elena, it's good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" Elena smiled, a determined glint in her eyes. "I need a favor," she said. "Something happened on my flight, and I think it's time we had a conversation about accountability in the airline industry." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Tell me everything." And as Elena began to recount the events of the flight, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, about challenging a system that too often allowed prejudice to go unchecked. She may have boarded that plane as just another passenger, but she was walking away with a mission. Elena Carter's demeanor was poised, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that silenced a room without raising its volume. The lead flight attendant, now standing at her side, appeared both nervous and perplexed. She clearly hadn't anticipated the